Hi, I'm Tony Russo, and this is In Case You Missed It from Kates-Boylston for the week ending Friday, April 4th, 2025. We have a ton of stuff that we want to talk about this week. There has been a new law passed in Colorado that makes it easier for funeral directors to help trans families. It is award season. There are plenty of awards that you can apply to receive, including ones to watch. And we'll talk about that a little bit more after the break. And also, we had a funeral director on Netflix on the John Mulaney's Everybody's Live with John Mulaney show. And I've got some stuff to say about it. We'll leave it at that for now. And of course, there is some more commentary on how we react with the newspapers and some plugs for another podcast that I heard that you guys might get a kick out of. All of that actually, and even more after this message from our friends and sponsors, Passages International. Looking for a way to honor your loved one while honoring the planet? At Passages, we specialize in eco-friendly funeral products made from renewable, biodegradable materials. Whether it's a stunning willow casket, a biodegradable urn for scattering, or our unique memorial keepsakes, we help create meaningful goodbyes that tread lightly on the earth. Join the movement toward greener funerals. Visit passagesinternational.com and discover how you can celebrate a life while protecting the planet for generations to come. Link in the show notes. First up, a bill is on its way to the governor's desk in Colorado that changes the ways that funeral directors can and actually must serve families. It is called A Bill for an Act Concerning the Designation of a Decedent's Gender Identity on the Decedent's Certificate of Death. And I have some reporting on it in this week's Funeral Service Insider. What's significant just off the top of the bat is that this allows funeral directors to not have to worry if there is a request to put a gender on the birth certificate that wasn't the gender assigned at birth. And this kind of makes it a little bit easier on families who want to make that choice on their own death certificates. There are some downsides, there are some upsides. One of the big downsides, and we get into it more in Funeral Service Insider, is that the mismatch doesn't account for a sex difference. So briefly, sex and gender are two different things. So for health reasons, for tracking different diseases and different causes of death by sex, it would make a lot more sense to have male and then female as the only sex options, and then list a couple of the other gender options that don't have to match up with the sex options. That, if you are doing one in your own state, is probably something to consider as it becomes clearer and clearer that the line between sex and gender is almost a completely separate one. And the other thing is, it can make it difficult if people want to go back and do and kind of revise. That isn't something that's really going to be able to happen. It does kind of put the burden on the person who wants control over how they are called at death. There are forms that can be filled out, or you can use any of the regular identifications that you use. But it's, I think, a step in the right direction. And I think that it's going to be good for death care. It doesn't put the funeral director in the middle anymore. The important part of this, of course, is since it's a law, funeral directors won't be able to refuse it, and funeral directors also won't be able to be blamed for not refusing it, because the law is the law. So if people complain that a funeral director has complied with these requests, they can just cite the law. And if a funeral director decides not to comply with a request, there's actually a misdemeanor attached to the refusal, the way it would be if you intentionally misfilled out any other government document. Anyway, link to the bill in the show notes and some deeper reporting in this edition of Funeral Service Insider, the newsletter, which will be out Sunday, I think. I have to just put my bias right on the table here and say that I do not like panel shows. I do not like talk shows. And I just want a little credit for watching some of a talk show with you, because I'm also, as I mentioned in the post that accompanied this, I'm a little John Mulaney'd out on top of that. But there was a funeral director on John Mulaney's new show, Everybody's Live with John Mulaney. And his name, I'm going to read it, is Raimundo Perez Palencia. And he is a funeral director out there in California. He was on the panel in the second half with Henry Winkler and Lunell and Pete Davidson. None of them had anything really interesting to say about death. They took turns pretending to die, and what would that look like, if you had to die in a scene. The funeral director didn't participate in that, which I thought was really classy of him. Given that he's on there, there's not else you can do. There are two things. There are really just two takeaways. If you don't have Netflix, I don't have Netflix. I got someone to let me use their thing. If you don't have Netflix, you certainly don't have to register for it just to see this clip. But if you do have Netflix, it's way toward the end of the show, and there's so much less about funeral service and that kind of thing than you would hope or expect. But I guess it is something. So two things. The first thing is my own little contribution to our Funerals of the Famous, which is the death of Rue McClanahan. Rue McClanahan was on the Golden Girls, and when she died, she sent her ashes to 6 different people. One of them was Norman Lear, and the sidekick on the John Mulaney show, his name is Richard Kind. Look him up. If you don't know him, you definitely know who he is. But Richard Kind said he was at Norman Lear's house when Norman Lear had Rue McClanahan's cremated remains, and he put them in his rose garden. And so the joke on the show was, they put Blanche on Rose. And we all got a huge kick out of that. But it was interesting to discuss how to handle cremated remains, because they did do another sequence where this woman called in and she talked about having her husband loaded into shotgun shells. And that was something that, that got a lot of laughs, but also that people talked about. And I think it's good to talk about possibilities, and we're going to talk about this over the next couple of weeks, I think. But in this kind of section, I want to talk about how trying to undermine the idea of funeral director as a dour person is a funeral director by funeral director kind of, I don't want to say responsibility, because unfortunately, there is still this huge disconnect between the consumer and funeral service that doesn't recognize how important and how accessible funeral directors are, how not like the regular run-of-the-mill stereotypes tend to be. And also, it's important to remember that the stereotypes are there for a reason, and that they persist at some level in lots of places. And this is one that I wanted to talk about. There was a story, another story, and a link in the show notes, about a funeral home that was sold in the mountains, the rural mountains, not far from where I live, in the rural mountains of Maryland, where this funeral director brought on an additional funeral director from the outside. From the outside, it looks like he's bringing in what will be his key employee, to whom he will eventually sell the business. That's the sense you got. But whether that's the case or not, I don't know. But when the reporter wrote this next part that I want to talk about, they wrote that there are so many different decisions that families have to make. And, now that there's the internet, people know more, and then they have more that they have to choose from. And I want to take exception to they have to, and I don't want to attribute to the funeral director, because it was not attributed to him in the story, but it gave me the opportunity to say what I'm about to say, which is how about families get to have so many more decisions, get to be so much more involved in funeral service? I think that little mindset flip, right? Turning it from a chore, these are all the things you have to do that you didn't used to have to do. No, you used to have to do what you were told to do. Now you have a choice and an opportunity as a grieving consumer, and funeral directors are open to helping, but there is this also kind of like grief helplessness where people maybe want to be led through, and that's of course the pre-need conversation. But for the at-need conversation, just this simple flip of the difference between having to do something and getting to do something attitudinally as a funeral service provider, talking about all of the wonderful options that you now have is just more appealing. And I think it would do well for funeral service and for families to think of the funeral planning process less as a chore. I mean, it is something that you have to do at the time of someone's death, but it's not something that you have to do like your taxes. It's your final opportunity to explore the possibilities for the person who's deceased, and talking to people about it that way just seems to make more sense. So link to those stories in the show notes, but we're going to talk about that more next week. I've already got a bunch of stuff for next week to talk about, and this week's not already even over yet. About a year ago, I spoke with a man named Todd Bozell about buying a funeral home and bringing his sons in. They were both, it was weird because he was a funeral director and his sons became funeral directors to join him in this business. And it was a great story. One of the really interesting parts of the story was the person from whom he bought it wanted to sell to someone who was going to keep it independent. And as part of that, they were hoping to get at least an extra generation, because what that funeral director told me at the time was, if you can sell to someone who has at least one child who is willing and able to take over the business, then you know that the business will go on for at least 50 more years, with the idea being 25 from the parent and then 25 from the child once the child became old enough, to run the funeral home. And I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at succession. And I did a feature on it, and I've taken the feature out from behind the paywall and put it up where you can see it. So there's a link to that in the show notes. The reason that Todd has crossed my mind today is because recently he was among two people put on the selected board. I'm just going to read you the beginning of the press release right now. The selected board director appointment committee has announced the selection of Todd Bozell, owner and president of Bozell Funeral Homes in LaPel, Indiana, and Megan Comer, owner and president of Alheiser Comer Mortuary in Escondido, California, as incoming board directors for the selected membership groups 2 and 6, respectively. He was just a good guy, and they had a very kind of independent spirit mindedness about them. So I as soon as I saw that he had been named to the board, I thought it was cool to at least shout him out and hopefully reshare his story so more people could see it. So link to the stories, both stories, in the show notes. I had joked earlier that it was award season, and I just joked that way because there are a couple of awards that I've been meaning to mention and haven't, and some more awards that were mentioned recently. So I want to get them, a couple of them, on your radar in case they're useful. Of course, the first one is the Ones to Watch, which I have mentioned before, but I would like to mention again. Ones to Watch is a Kates-Boylston award, and it is a special issue where we highlight funeral directors, up-and-coming funeral directors and mortuary students who are deserving of a spotlight. You can nominate a person by following the link in the show notes. And one of the things that we always get a kick out of here is it's rare that someone who wins one to watch designation doesn't end up making news sometime in the nearer future, and end up being, another cover of American Funeral Director or getting, highlighted in some way. So that's always exciting. There's also the Green Burial Council is taking nominations for its 2025 Leadership Awards. And again, that is a link to that in the show notes. And the Green Burial Council's Leadership Award is given to individuals, organizations, or businesses who have demonstrated foresight, innovation, and extraordinary commitment to the environment through environmental sustainability in the area of human death care practices. So this is one that it's a big one that people are happy to get every year. And if you know someone who's worthy of that nomination, I would send it along. The Funeral Service Foundation is now accepting scholarship applications to CANA's 107th Cremation Innovation Convention, set for August 6th to 8th in Phoenix, Arizona. It is valued at $2,200, and it helps people to get to the convention. Again, link to the show notes to apply. The reason I mentioned that last is not a kind of last but not least thing, but also this, as we're recording this last week, the Funeral Service Foundation announced a new project that they're trying. It's called Impact 1000. And what Impact 1000 does is it challenges people to say that they will donate $1,000 per year for the next 5 years. And in doing that, it not only helps the Funeral Foundation better plan and gives them like kind of more consolidated funding opportunities, but it allows people who are participating in this program special access and privileges to help affect the way that the Funeral Service Foundation makes its decisions about which scholarships go to whom and why. More information on that is also in the show notes. And that is it in the awards department for now. If you have any awards that need giving out or that need shouting out, just give me a holler here at Funeral Service Insider, the podcast, or in the In Case You Missed It section. We will have contact information at the end, but I would love to get some feedback on which awards are coming out and which awards need to be better celebrated. Before I get started, I want to clean up the legalese here, so allow me. Data referenced with the permission of the National Funeral Directors Association. All rights reserved. That is what I'm supposed to say when I talk about the information available in the recently released Changing Consumer Preferences, a Generational Perspective on Attitudes Toward Funeral Service, which the NFDA is touting as a first-of-its-kind generational study. And it was conducted by a conducting firm. What are they called? A survey firm. There are two quick things that I want to say about it, and then the rest I'm going to let you read because you have a link to in the show notes, and if you will trade your email address, they will let you download the entire report. It's about 25 pages long. The first thing that I thought was really interesting was that Generation Z always comes off very well in these. And I mentioned this before. I mentioned this last year because they NFDA put out a different survey that said, Gen Z are going to bring back casket burial. And that sounded very suspicious to me. And then when I was speaking with Tanya Marsh of Wake Forest Law, who did a similar report last year, I said the same thing to her, and she said that the information is good and that the information stands. But one of the things that she pointed out was that the interesting thing about the data is we don't know, since this is the first year or early days anyway. Who knows how long these have been being done? If everyone's doing the first one, I don't know if there's going to be a second one. But this idea of following generations, and do 20-somethings just prefer the idea of being embalmed and laid out in a casket? Or is that a generational thing? Like, are they still going to want that when they're in their 70s? And so is the perception about how a funeral should go different over time for young and old? One of the other things, because what we got to talk about, Tanya and I, and this I think I've said on this show before, but certainly it's in the podcast. And if you missed the show with her, you definitely should check it out. One of the things that we discussed was a lot of these don't pass the gut check test, but that just means that we need more data, because even though it feels wrong, it's not, the data holds up. But one of the things that she said about anecdotal evidence was, even though we have these reports that say, Gen Z is more interested in being embalmed and more interested in being buried than any of the other generations, that is also a lot of times before they've been well educated on all of the different options. As I was saying earlier in the show, all the things that you get to decide, not that you have to decide, but that you get to decide. And the idea that when they continue to find more options, then their opinions shift. But right now, if asked, generally the perception is you either are cremated or you have a great huge funeral like you see in the movies. There doesn't seem to be any kind of middle ground in the public's mind. That is not the funeral director's fault, but it is something with which funeral directors must contend. Anyway, if you haven't seen the report yet, you will have it shortly. I will let them do all of their own kind of analysis on their numbers. I just wanted to pass it along with those two caveats that I had in my head, and there's a link to all of those things in the show notes. And speaking just real quick of Wake Forest law, there is a podcast out. The Wake Forest has a podcast. It's called The Legal Deke. But the last two episodes have been about death care. I want to read you the titles. The Heirs Property Project and Laws of the Dead. And these are two death care related episodes in a podcast that's a legal podcast in general. Worth checking out, especially if you listen to podcasts and you like podcasts, then and you're interested in death care, you really can't go wrong. So there's a link to that in the show notes. And that will do it for this time. In case you missed it, is a Kates-Boylston production. It was written and edited by me, Tony Russo. Please follow us on Apple, subscribe on whatever podcast catcher you are listening now, or follow us or subscribe to us on YouTube by ringing that little bell on the top. All of those ways you will get notified when we have new shows out, which is often enough. So we have this one every Friday, in case you missed it, which is this news roundup thing that I do. And we have the Funeral Service Insider, the podcast. That's kind of the flagship. That is every other week. Coming up this week, as I'm recording this, it is April 3rd. We have Ryan Reyes talking about getting funeral service on LinkedIn. And the week after that, we have Joelle Maldonado, who is also known as the Grave Woman and who does stuff with hair and skin and practice that we'll talk about on that show as well. If you would like to leave us feedback, we would love it. You can email me. Follow the link in the show notes at the bottom of this post. There's one of those little email things. Just click on that and you can send me an email, or you can call and leave me a voicemail. My phone number is 732-746-0233, extension 709. That is 732-746-0233, extension 709. And that will do it for this time on In Case You Missed It.